Hello, and thank you for taking a listen to this week's episode of Secure Insights with NDK Cyber. NDK Cyber, first and foremost, are a cybersecurity talent organization hiring roles for organizations in rapid growth mode, who are established, who are on the vendor, on the services side of the house, who are in the end user world, across all skill sets from entry through to leadership and all the weird and wonderful things between. We've got this podcast series here to really shine a light on certain areas of cybersecurity, areas that are being talked about, areas that perhaps need to be talked about a little bit more. And this week, very excited to be joined by Erkhang Zheng. Erkang is the founder and chairman of JupiterOne, an organization that looks at asset visibility. So a very important area of cybersecurity for a lot of different organizations for a number of reasons. Today we talk through challenges when it comes to asset visibility, particularly from a user perspective. We look at how AI will change the game, big buzzword there for sure. Regulations, how they're coming in, how they're influencing the world of visibility and software. And I guess the importance of proactive risk management as well. So very excited to share the episode with yourself, and always open to the feedback. Enjoy it.
We're live. Well, okay, thank you very much for jumping on.
Yeah, good to be here, James. Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. Well, excited to get stuck in. Now, the listeners would have just heard an introduction from me, likely very butchered. So are you okay to just give a quick overview of your background and where you're at now?
Yeah, of course. I'm the founder of JupiterOne. JupiterOne is a cybersecurity data platform. We focus on using asset management to achieve a number of proactive security outcomes, including vulnerability prioritization, proactive risk management, continuous compliance, and so on. My background has been in cybersecurity and technology for the past 20 plus years. I've been a practitioner in cybersecurity, been a technologist engineer by training, and been a former CISO, right, and led different global practices of cybersecurity at large and small organizations like IBM and Fidelity and so on and so forth. And a few years ago, right, I decided to build JupiterOne because I have this first-hand challenge of something that is very fundamental in every security program, right, which starts with knowing what you have. And if you don't know what you have, it's very difficult to protect, right? And it's to get to a deep and granular level of that details, given the complexity of today's technology infrastructure and the enterprise environment. It's actually a pretty challenging task, as we come to find out. So that's the journey so far.
Cool. I'm excited to get stuck in. I was going to ask you actually, often in these situations, a technology or a company is born out of necessity or maybe a snag you come across often, and that clearly was the case here where, what are we protecting, guys? We need to know. Let's build a solution to get it done.
Yeah, and of course, right, if you think about it, right, so what is security, right? Security is protecting the business, right? Security, it used to be a very IT-oriented function, but we all know that it's more than that. It's about protecting the business. It's about reducing risk, right? And the scope of what cybersecurity involves has dramatically expanded, right, over the years. And the definition of asset visibility, asset management has also expanded dramatically over the years, right? It used to be, network oriented, something with an IP address, right? But now it's everything software defined, and all of the granular resources, anything from people to identities to code and cloud. And of course, you still have to cover your on-premises assets and IT devices and all those things, right? So that combination of things, and combined with, ownerships and business statuses and context of all of these resources and how these things are connected, right? So that's what modern day asset visibility, asset management is really involved, and that can be a pretty daunting, challenging task.
Yes, I mean, you touched on some of the points there, especially I guess if you're an organization that's been on-prem, now moving into the cloud, you've got all your SaaS applications, you've got AI in the mix. Let's chuck in another buzzword. Why not?
There you go. Throwing a lot of buzzwords.
There we go. I think we lasted 4 minutes before we mentioned AI there, so we've done well. So I guess under
It's
this whole,
like any call, right? So, podcasts or cybersecurity or IT or non-IT calls, right? So AI is a topic everywhere.
of course, of course. So I guess from what you see, what are some of the difficulties you'd have in tracking and managing assets effectively?
I think this is we mentioned some of that already, right? So one is the expansion of the definition of assets, right? So to cover those, it's not like historically you can track those things with a spreadsheet or with a simple database. Is no longer that way, and you have to be able to aggregate, unified all of those things into the same place from all of these different sources. And most of these are API driven, software defined sources. And the other challenge is that there are multiple sources of sometimes the same asset, right? So if you talk about a particular device and the information about that asset can come from multiple agents and multiple providers. Let's just say a server or a workload or a laptop, right? And information about that device can come from CrowdStrike, can come from Amazon, can come from multiple different places, and to be able to unify that, to know that that is the same device, right? So that also is a challenge. And beyond that, right? So you want to know everything about this resource, right? So to properly protect it, and you want to know as much about this resource as possible. And that information can come from an aggregation of, multiple connected things. And some of those are not directly associated with the asset itself, right? So there's information of the asset and information about the asset. And then there's all of these contributing attributes that may provide additional insight into the value, the ownership, the classification, and so on and so forth, right? To make all of those information in a consolidated, centralized, and consistent view from fragmented systems is very hard.
And I guess
right?
if you have
And also, if you think about that, I'll add one more thing, right? So if you think about the amount of resources and assets that a large enterprise may have, millions and of them, right? And to do that consistently and to aggregate those and think about all of these, you have 50, 100 different providers all sending you information about assets. And to do that consistently every time, right, is also very hard. So there's multiple challenges.
And with that, so to taking that fragmented systems piece and point, obviously there's risks behind that because if you haven't got it, you don't know what you're protecting. But I imagine there's a huge resource effort to sort of bring those systems together under one roof. I don't know how it works on a granular level, but without, say, some sort of solution in place, that must be a nightmare for a resource perspective to bring together.
Of course, and which is why companies like JupiterOne exist, right? So we're here to help tackle that challenge, and because it's difficult and it's been something that we all know that's necessary and needed, is the foundation of most programs, if not all programs. It's very difficult to do well, right? So there's varying degrees of maturity and flavors of asset management, asset visibility in organizations, right? Some use homegrown solutions, some still use spreadsheets, right? So some use, data lakes that they've built themselves and, sitting on top of a Snowflake or Databricks or something, right? And then we also have all sorts of other systems, right, that people may use, and from legacy to modern, right? So this is, various degrees of solutions that have been tackling this problem. It hasn't been solved.
But AI is going to fix all of this, right? It's going to just fix it all completely.
Yeah, AI will fix everything for us. Yeah. And we all have to worry about our jobs too, but that's a different topic. Yeah, would you want to get into AI?
Let's jump in. I'm keen to get your take on this, because from the outside in, it seems like it might be able to automate discovery somehow. I don't know if it can sort of improve accuracy or efficiency in this particular space? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think it helps and it will, right? So of course, like any other technology company, we're exploring and implementing AI to help provide better experiences and better efficiency for our customers and within the JupiterOne platform, right? But of course, AI still has its own challenges, right? Because AI by nature is non-deterministic, right? So, and when we talk about security, you have to be accurate, right? So 90% accuracy is just not good enough, right? So we have to strive for as close to 100% as possible, especially when it comes to data, right? If AI tells you something and it's incorrect, and you make decisions based on that, incorrect answer, it can be extremely devastating, right? So in some cases, but how AI will change and will help, right? So it will help speed up, integrations and getting resources into the system. And on the other hand, this is what we are very excited about is AI would certainly help with the analytics of that data, right? So, putting in enough guardrails and giving access to the right amount of data and the constraint data in a specific scope, it can do a lot of the analysis for you in a very advanced and efficient way, right? So without the user being the expert of a particularly complex data model, right? AI can understand that much faster, easier.
Understood.
So that's how we're leveraging it, right? So at J1, right? So the data comes in, right? So kind of tied into the first part that we talked about. This amount of data is vast, and the modeling, right, of that data, how one thing connect to each other, right? So which is one key aspect of understanding assets, right? Not just seeing it, but understanding the connections and relationships of the contextual aspects of these resources, right? Your infrastructure it results in a pretty complex data model. Now we use graph to represent it, right? So, but that complexity sometimes is very difficult to understand for people who's new to that type of data model or new to the graph representation of data and so on, right? So we leverage AI to help people kind of get over that learning curve very quickly, so that you can just ask questions in natural language and ask AI to query the data for you, so that you don't have to understand the complexity and the querying and so on. And at the same time, would ask AI to help analyze the result for you, right? So you can focus on the business use case, the security operational use case, or the compliance and controls monitoring use case, right? So apply the expert knowledge and apply the use cases, instead of focusing on the technical aspects of those things.
Understood. And I was going to ask you, but before AI, the olden days now, how would somebody digest all this data? Would that be a very manual process? And again, eating into your time, your resource?
You have to be a security expert, right? So then you also have to have knowledge of complex data models. You have to be an analyst, right? And you have to know coding language, and you have to be technical. So I'm going to be an engineer, right? So, we have a lot of those customers and users on top of the JupiterOne platform, right? But they are the power users, right? So before AI, then you have to be a power user. You have to be a domain expert in all those things, right? And you still need that, but you can now have less experienced or junior folks to help, right? So have access to AI to help with, understanding the data model and the domain experts a little better, right? So AI can be that, right? So AI can be the domain expert. It has the knowledge of, for example, all the best practice of AWS, best practices and configurations. And it has the insights of the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? And so on and so forth, right? It can apply that. On one hand, it has that knowledge. On the other hand, it has the knowledge of the data that represent your assets, right? And what bridge that is, in our case, right? So what JupiterOne provides is that query language and the data model that connect the dots and bridge the two. And if you're asking to say that, hey, do I meet this particular NIST standard? And here's my data, right? If you think about that, right? So before, then you have to understand both, right? You have to understand, hey, what is that standard telling me? What is that requirement? How does that translate into how the data is represented? Right? So with AI, we can much easier bridge the two and connect the dots.
Understood. Okay, cool. And you mentioned this there, and I want to come on to regulations in a moment. But when it comes to AI, just flipping it on the AI point slightly, if you're in an environment where maybe you haven't sort of sufficiently mapped your assets, you don't really know what you're protecting, is there an element of AI from a bad actor perspective, or even from an internal user perspective, using AI within an environment where you don't know where your assets are or what they're doing? Does that pose additional risk, or is that not too much of a factor?
Look, I think with any new technology, there's a lot of risk and unknowns involved, right? So just like cloud, right? And when cloud first came up, and there's a lot of abuse of cloud technologies, and there's a lot of bad actors leveraging it in advance of the good guys, leveraging it, right? So AI is the same, right? So we have seen in the field a significant increase in attackers using AI in various different forms, right? Probably more obviously is the phishing type of attacks, right? So, the phishing emails and gets more sophisticated, and the deep fakes, gets more real, and so on, right? But using AI in terms of having access to data, I think, if you put enough guardrails, right? And again, just with technology is how you leverage it and how you implement it. Putting enough guardrails, then it is safe, right? And you can implement it in a safe way, and having the right models, right? So having the right privacy and security implementations, and using enterprise APIs, or in some cases, in our cases, allowing self-hosted models and so on, right? And only putting in non-sensitive data in certain cases, right? So there's enough guardrails that we can implement to make it safe and reduce the amount of risk.
Understood. No, interesting. Okay, cool. And just jumping back to that point you mentioned earlier, NIST, I want to get your take on, we're seeing a lot of regulations, updates, new regulations coming through. That must hit this world big time, no?
Yeah, I think, regulations, a lot of times I view that as a necessary evil, and I think it's a double-edged sword in a lot of cases. I do think that is helpful in increasing the bottom line and the minimum requirements of security, right? But I think the challenge is in really, maybe I'll describe this twofold, right? So one, the challenge is in the details of how you implement to meet a particular requirement, right? So I'll give you maybe a couple of examples. Let's just use asset visibility as one example, right?
Sure.
There's the check the box once a year approach, all right? And, of course, regulations and since many years ago have said, asset inventory, asset visibility is number one in your security program, right? So if you look at, NIST and CIS and, PCI and many other frameworks, it's the same, right? They say that. But the difference is in the how and when and where and how often, right? So it's those. It's not the binary whether or not do I have it.
Mhm.
So on one hand, you can say that, I have it. It's a spreadsheet. I update it once a year.
Mhm.
Okay. And it may be complete. It may not be. Who knows?
Mhm.
Right. On the other hand, you say that I have fully automated and it's updated in near real time, every hour or every day. It's continuous and it's aggregated from all of the sources of my entire enterprise infrastructure. That's a very different implementation. Although, in kind of it depends on the auditor, right? So who you talk to, from an untrained eyes, right? So they all meet the requirement that says you have asset inventory. They
Mhm.
both check the box, right? So I think this is where it gets tricky, right? So regulations do help. They do help establish a baseline. They do help raise the baseline, over time. But it can become all of a sometimes check the box and provide a false sense of security if you just do that, check the
Mhm.
box approach.
So with that then, are compliance mandates really driving an adoption of solid asset visibility tooling, or is it the journey we're on? Maybe I don't know.
I think it's helping a little bit, but not as much as we had all hoped, right?
Mm.
This goes into probably the other part of the challenge with compliance is that there's so many requirements in a compliance framework, and then not to mention there are so many different versions and flavors of different regulations that you may have to meet, especially if you're in regulated industries, right? So there's a thing called UCF, right? Unified Compliance Framework. If you look at that, there's like thousands, and if not, tens or hundreds of thousands of actual requirements that maps to hundreds of different compliance frameworks, right? There are just too many,
Mm.
and organizations and typical organizations, we're not talking about the Fortune 100s, right? So we're talking about the broader the market, right, or the broader industry of people who need security in general. It's hard to know, like, how much to allocate your limited resources and budget to each of these requirements, when there are so many. And a lot of cases that I don't think that asset visibility is getting enough visibility, right? So kind of pun intended a little bit there, but it's not getting enough attention because there are, we are all, asset visibility is almost like a wellness thing, right? It's almost like a, vitamin to your program. And whereas a lot of organizations, they're currently in pain, right? They need more painkillers,
Mm.
right? And they need the reactive solutions, the detection and response solutions, more than the preventative and the proactive solutions. So, which is, a little bit from a practitioner standpoint, right? So it's a little bit sad to see because that does not advance the program in a positive way, right? You kind of go through that cycle, but you're not going forward, right? So you're still kind of repeating, the same
Mm.
cycles of spending money on tools, and then the program over time is not getting much better,
Mm.
right? Because that you haven't really spent a lot of energy and resources on the foundation,
Yeah.
and the foundation is asset visibility.
And in your opinion, because it always, like you say, rolls into being proactive on the risk management front, there seems to be like maybe a bit of not resistance, maybe that's the wrong word, or is it awareness? I don't know, but like you say, there's this often big emphasis on incident response and tackling once the problem's here. But
Yeah,
why aren't people too keen to do the proactive thing? Is it a spend thing or a culture thing or?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? So I think it's the amount of resources and budget, right? So like I mentioned before,
Hmm.
and the other thing is that sometimes it's very hard to quantify the ROI of the proactive risk management, right? And I think, look, these two things actually go hand in hand, right? So I'm glad that you mentioned the term proactive risk management, right? So there are different terminologies out there in the industry now. And one of them is called CTAM, Continuous Threat and Exposure Management, which is an extension of vulnerability management and posture management, right? And there are new terminologies being used, something like a ROC, ROC instead of a SOC, right? So a SOC is for Security Operations Center, ROC is for Risk Operations Center, right? And is more of the proactive aspects of cybersecurity, right? Whereas the SOC deals with the detection response, the reactive aspect of cybersecurity, right? So that's very much in line of my view and JupiterOne's view. Is there is a proactive risk management approach and engineering approach, almost like security engineering approach, right? So to the overall security program, and that ties into asset management, right? Because if you think about risk management, it's you have to know what resource are potentially at risk, and not just the vulnerability aspects of it, right? So the misconfigurations and the findings, but also the contextual knowledge about the resource itself, right? Is it a crown jewel? Is it important? Is it leading to something that is important? Is there an attack path to something that is important, right? So that is the asset visibility part of risk management. And risk management today is challenging because we take very much of a technical aspect of it, and we look at risks a lot of times from a technical findings perspective, and we're all very overwhelmed by the amount of findings that are generated by various scanners, hundreds of thousands, sometimes more, right, for a sizable organization. And it's very difficult to prioritize them in a meaningful way and in a continuous way, right? So as a result, right, so then a lot more effort are put into other aspect of security, because that sometimes is a little bit of a lost cost. Right? But the reality is, if we can do asset management in a better, more efficient, and a more contextual way, that we can end up with a much better proactive risk management, because then we can connect those dots.
Yeah, I get you. Get out in front of it. And is this just for your big Fortune 500 companies, or?
I think they would benefit the most, but I think smaller size organizations, I would say, especially kind of mid-size organizations, will benefit significantly from starting early, because then if you don't, then you sort of get into the challenge that larger enterprises have today, right? They've already accumulated so much technical debt around this area, and they've already implemented maybe inefficient solutions, but they've put so much effort and energy into it, and it's sometimes a little bit hard to migrate, right? Once you have already so much debt and legacy, you're already on a train, then it's hard to get off and jump on a new train, right?
Yeah,
so,
of course.
Yeah.
Baking it in for the beginning is important then.
That's right. Yeah, getting it done right at the beginning, right? But of course, then you have different challenges, right? So it's then, early on, how much do you invest in it, right? And versus later on, the problem is significant, but it may be already kind of late, right? So now you have the challenge and you have the funding, but you also have all of these limitations and constraints. Versus that you're early on, but do you have enough focus and investment into this area to do it right from the beginning?
Yeah, I guess like you said previously, it's that whole return on investment thing. And if I am looking after security in X organization. How am I going to justify that to
Yeah.
my higher
No,
ups?
but I'll tell you why. So this is our approach, right? So with J1, and this is why having a platform, data platform like us is important, because then we can apply multiple use cases on top of it to give you a higher ROI, right? And a lot of the organizations are going after cost savings, right? So if you think about the visibility that JupiterOne provides, and it's not just a cybersecurity, it's not just risk management, right? Because it's the consolidation of your digital environment, right? So it's almost like having a digital twin of your environment, so you can analyze and look at. We also identify cost savings opportunities,
Okay.
for your engineering teams. Right. So I think you want to look at asset management, asset visibility, not necessarily just from a security and risk perspective. You can also look at it from an operational, engineering, and IT perspective. Right. So if you combine the two, then the ROI becomes a lot more apparent. Right. So if you spend, $50,000-$100,000 with the platform, and whatever that amount is, right? And then you end up saving, $50 or $100,000, right? So then, hey, guess what? The solution is actually free and pays for itself.
Understood. Well, that's an interesting take, the money save piece in areas that are non-cyber focused. I think that's
Yeah.
something I don't see an awful lot of every day. Well, have you got like an example or two of like how you would identify something where we could save money?
Yeah, of course, right? So not just save money, but also save time, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples, right? So we are able to help identify unused resources in cloud environments, right? And we can identify data repositories and data stores that are not connected or not used by a workload, or things like keys and other type of cloud resources that are disconnected from other things, right? So by using a graph data model, right, it's relatively straightforward to see that, well, if there are sort of unconnected resources, right? So everything should be connected somehow, right? If you have kind of dangling resources by themselves, it kind of means that either they're misconfigured or they're not being used, right? So those are huge cost saving opportunities. Now, because of the data platform nature, we can also help analyze how resources may be configured and look different than others, right? And if you have repositories and workloads configured that are significantly higher tier than all of the other workloads that you have in your applications, that might be an outlier, right? So that might be a cost saving opportunity, and right, and it's not just signing up for savings plans or pre-purchase and that type of things, right? And is the architectural analysis that we can help engineering teams perform that can identify the savings.
Love
right?
that. Yeah.
On the other hand, it's the time savings too, right? So we have several of our customers and their IT and engineering team use J1 more than their security team.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and even they look up things like, hey, I have this particular instance I'm looking for in this particular VPC or subnet, and I have like thousands of AWS or Azure or GCP environments. I don't know where it is. I don't have the time to go into each one to look in their interface. Can I just go in J1 and query that, right? So that saves massive amount of time, right? And on the other hand, for cybersecurity use cases, we have a huge global bank, right? So, they used to write highly customized controls for continuous monitoring. And every time they write a control, it takes, days, sometimes weeks to code and to deploy across their thousands of environments. And with J1, it instead of taking days and weeks, it takes minutes. Like I think they told us 11 minutes to be precise, for that controls to be written, deployed, tested across thousands of their environments.
Insane.
So exactly, and that's just one control, right? So imagine that you have hundreds and maybe thousands of them. and saving from days to minutes. How much time is that?
Yeah, that's an awful lot to think about. Crikey.
Yeah.
I feel like we could, there's a few rabbit holes we could really go down here, and we've kind of only scratched the surface on the whole asset visibility landscape at the moment, I know, but I think there was an awful lot in there. Thank you for running through all those. I know I darted us around a few different directions there, but no, I think we're at time, so let's wrap up. But we'll chuck your LinkedIn and whatnot in the description below, so people can get in touch if needed and things. But no, I appreciate you jumping on. I think there's an episode or two to perhaps follow up with.
Yeah, sounds great.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much for your time.